Hello, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. launch of Melanie Chen's The Burrow. Melanie will be in conversation with Weike Wang, whose latest book, Rental House, publishes on December 3rd. My name is Audrey Huang, and I am one of the booksellers at Belmont Books in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping matters. For those of you who are local, we have a few more events in December to wrap up the year. Check out our event page at belmontbooks.com. Melanie and Weike will be in conversation tonight, and around 7:45, they'll be answering the questions in the Q&A box down below. Please feel free to chime in throughout their chat to help guide their conversation. Melanie Cheng is an award-winning author and doctor based in Melbourne, Australia. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, The Age, The Saturday Paper, and The Big Issue, among many others. And according to a few of our booksellers, the book Burrow is a story of tragedy, grief, and happiness. Tragedy, grief, and forgiveness, small, quiet, and perfect. Like the baby bunny at its center. I love this one. Another bookseller said, a quiet and quite lovely book about a grieving family and the pet bunny that brings them comfort. This small packs a big emotional punch. Weike Wang is a graduate of Harvard University, where she earned her undergrad degree in chemistry and a doctorate in public health. Her first novel, Chemistry, received a number of awards, including a 5 under 35 honoree of the National Book Foundation. She currently lives in New York City. Now, a few observations from our booksellers about Rental House. Not only does it have sharp and insightful observations, it's funny. Another bookseller is a committed Weike Wang fan. She had great chemistry with Chemistry. She was more than okay with Jonah's Okay. And she couldn't quite think of a bad pun for Rental House, but she loved that book too. Wry, emotionally complex, and a satisfying story. It's highly recommended. Now let's welcome our two authors.
Hi.
Hi,
Hello, hi everyone. Hi, Mel. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Hi,
Okay,
hi, Weike.
perfect. Good. How are you doing?
I'm really good, thank you.
Congratulations on this excellent book. I think what they said quite perfect, small. I also read a review and I really like this phrase, soft beauty of the book. And I think it has a lot of that. Like the sentences are beautiful. There's this like tenderness. And there's this just family trying to recover from just like a really big incident that has happened, a really big kind of void that has opened up in the family. I was wondering if you wanted to do a reading or we could just talk about the book, whatever you prefer.
I'm happy to start with a reading. It will introduce readers to, a couple of central characters. So this reading comes from the book is told in from 4 different perspectives in alternating chapters, and this chapter is told from the perspective of the daughter Lucy, and when she first encounters the rabbit, which is plays a key role in this story of this family. The family had decided that during the day, when they were home, the rabbit would be free to roam the fenced backyard. But at night, when cats were prowling and birds of prey were hunting, he would be safer inside the hutch. It was a 2-story structure with an upstairs bedroom and a play area on the ground floor. After a couple of heated arguments, the family had agreed on a location in the left corner of the backyard, beside the water tank and in front of the shed. For weeks, Lucy had imagined a mini lock bounding through the chipboard arches and scaling the timber ramp. But that first evening, much to Lucy's disappointment, the rabbit had refused to enter his new home. Instead, he'd spent the night in the vandalized cardboard box placed on the floor of Lucy's room. The rabbit was always watching, always listening. He was completely in tune with his environment. He was doing everything the soft-spoken man in the mindfulness video had told Lucy to do. Only the rabbit didn't look relaxed. Not at all. Perhaps, Lucy contemplated, relaxation was just for predators. She had a flashback to a David Attenborough documentary she'd watched once with her dad during the school holidays. She remembered the way the lions had slept, with their legs long and their bellies exposed and their bulging neck veins on glorious show. The rabbit didn't like being touched, When she reached out to pat his back, he pulled his body flat against the grass like a cat to avoid her fingers. And when she tried to pick him up, he boxed her with his paws and scratched her with his claws, trimmed to uselessness by the breeder. After a few days, he would permit some brief strokes of his head and nose, but even then it was a reluctant surrender, a flinch followed by a slow melting of muscles, a hesitant closing of eyes.
Oh, beautiful. Wonderful. Why did you choose that segment?
Well, I wanted to choose from early in the book so as not to have any spoilers, but also because one of the reasons and the inspiration for the book came from my own family taking in a mini lop rabbit during 2020.
Miles? Is this
Miles,
Miles?
Miles, named after by my son, my 10-year-old son, after Miles Morales, the Spider-Man character. But I also really loved that name, Miles, for a rabbit. It just kind of conjured up this bespectacled, waistcoated kind of creature.
I know, I love it. It's such a formal name. I love it.
But the reason, I mean, I was in quite a period of creative drought during the pandemic. I was working as a healthcare worker. I was homeschooling my 2 primary school age children. And it was, I wasn't feeling very inspired. And we took in this pet rabbit, mainly for my daughter, who has been obsessed with rabbits ever since she was very young. She was born in the Chinese year of the rabbit and always had a soft toy rabbit. So
that's great.
So there was some connection there. And but I didn't know a lot about rabbits. They're not a traditional pet, like cats and dogs.
Are they easy to raise? Do they get roaming periods in the house?
I think that's different. And then the main thing that struck me when caring for this rabbit and taking him in was just how, of course, they're a prey animal, which I think you forget. And you forget also that cats and dogs are predators, and that prey animals, their behavior is constantly fearful and watchful and hypervigilant. And to be caring for this animal during those early days of the pandemic, when I myself was feeling quite fearful and watchful and hypervigilant, was this great mirror and for my own anxieties. And I was interested in kind of writing towards that and interrogating that. And that was where the spark came for the book. So I wanted to read from that section just because it touches on that kind of nature of prey animals.
Yeah, and sort of this idea of kind of being caged in during the pandemic. The book happens during the lockdown, right? There's a lot of anxiety in the family already, and they sort of kind of form this like bubble, and you can kind of see the bubble being protective or actually terrible for the family, especially if the family is kind of going through something really hard, right? So in this book, I loved how you kind of played with that, right? Like if you like the person you're with in the bubble, it's great. If you don't like the person you're with in the bubble, it's terrible. Like I think during the pandemic, we had couples break up because they were just spending way too much time with each other. And Jin and Amy, right, are kind of in a rough patch. And when Jin like gets to kind of be a little bit out of the bubble, he's so relieved, he's like so happy to be that. So what do you think like this book is trying to kind of look at in terms of marriage and sort of that lens that, the pandemic kind of brought spotlighted really relationships like that?
Yeah. And look, when I started writing the book, I didn't want to necessarily write about the pandemic. It was still quite fresh, quite raw. From a practical point of view, industry insiders told me readers don't really want to go there. I don't know if you heard the same thing. You wrote a book set in the
totally. In my book with Jonah, I had to like really shove the pandemic in there because it was like I didn't want to write it either, but when you have a physician character sometimes around this period, that was like one of the biggest things that they were handling, right?
And similarly, I write contemporary fiction. So to not also address it felt somewhat dishonest. And I could also see the opportunities for how that setting would really enhance a lot of the themes that I was interested in terms of grief. We were all going through a kind of collective form of grief, but also, isolation, and isolation from the world, as you described, but then also this kind of claustrophobia within households. And, for writing, it's great because it creates this kind of pressure cooker. And for this family in particular, of course, the rabbit is a welcome visitor, but Pauline, Amy's mother, who has been somewhat estranged until now, is forced, well, not forced, but kind of circumstances force her to come back into this family home because she's in need of care. And that is this, real disruptor to this family, who have been largely stagnant for 4 years since the accident. They're kind of, in this paralyzed state of the depressed stage of grief, basically. And so I've always been interested in the high drama that occurs, within domestic settings. And I think perhaps that comes from my work as a general practitioner, which is a family physician, I think you referred it to in the States, because I have insights into the kind of high stakes drama that occurs behind closed walls, whether it's between, as you mentioned, spouses, or between mothers and daughters, as well as occurs in this family. And so for so long, for 4 years, this family have not really discussed the circumstances of baby Ruby's death. And now that they're being kind of forced together, they can no longer avoid it by just escaping the home time. And that interested me as a writer.
Of course. I think confronting problems, confronting external, internal demons is amazing, on the page, obviously not like personal experience. And as a physician, like you said, you probably are there. You're there when the family is the most vulnerable, right? So like you see a lot of those really hard moments. Was that kind of what sort of focused you on this idea? Because grief is pretty central to this. And they've been a few years out of the accident. It's not like fresh, this thing that kind of imploded in the family. But it's almost like it happened yesterday for them, they can't forget it. How do you think grief is working in this family, or just like, in your experience with that?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it does come from having witnessed families who have experienced loss, especially that kind of sudden accidental loss, which if you are family, not a family of faith, there's a lot of kind of burden of responsibility that people bear about, oh, what could I have done differently? I could have prevented some way, and that's what the individual members are each kind of stewing in this. And so I've seen that, I've witnessed that. I also wanted to, with my third book, I'm older, I wanted to really write towards my kind of greatest fear, which as a parent is the loss of a child. And obviously I haven't experienced that firsthand. So I did have to draw on some of those insights gained through my work. I also discovered, as I was kind of pitching this book, that, the loss of a child is a bit like the pandemic, in the sense that publishers don't often want to go there, like, because readers are understandably also wary about that. And I understand that as a parent as well. And yet it is also part of the spectrum of human experience. And one of the most moving moments I've had throughout touring the book in Australia have been when people from the audience have approached me after the event to disclose that they had experienced the loss of a child. And often they are quite emotional when they're telling me this, and the fact that they have read the book and that it resonated with them, to me, is the highest kind of form of praise, maybe more than any, you know, review in a newspaper, to know that like they found some truth in that, because in the end it was an exercise of my imagination informed through some insights from work. But yeah, to know that has been really moving. Yeah.
I mean, I think I always trust my readers, or you know, this imaginary reader in my head, more than the reviewer. I don't really read reviews. Do you read reviews of your material or things like that?
Look, I do. I even read Goodreads. I even read Goodreads
Oh, you
reviews.
do?
Like I
Oh,
do.
wow.
Like I embrace it. I think I'm pretty thick-skinned now. I think medical training will do. Like I've been called awful things throughout my medical training, been bullied. So a review is yeah, I can take it. And even the bad reviews, you know, I'm interested in it. I'm interested in how the work's interpreted. I'm, especially now with the third book, you know, I'm not precious about things. In fact, I find it yeah, like fascinating how the work is interpreted and how people bring their own experiences to the work. And I'm not going to say I'm completely, I'll get upset for sure. If you know that there's a review of my first novel, Room for a Stranger, which I always quote. In Australia, we have actually events where people can go, writers can join together and read out their 1-star reviews from Goodreads. It's kind of
really, that's amazing.
A cathartic experience. So
wow.
For my book, which was like, this is like eating a cold boiled egg without any salt and not even a sip of water. That was like my worst review ever. But you know, it's more than outweighed by the good reviews, and yeah, I can take it.
That's great. I mean, I don't know. I don't do it. I can't, like, I sometimes wish like people would stop sending me the reviews, because I'm just like, I don't need to read it, you know? And you know, with social media, it's so hard because they will tag you in their review of your book, and if they don't like it, they also tag you. So I'm like, I don't need to be tagged. Like, I don't need to like this constant validation. And I'm a teacher. I'm a writing teacher, and I try to imagine my students handling that, and I think they would be so crushed, because if I say one word of criticism to them, they're like, oh my God, you know, you don't like this comma, you want me to delete this comma? Like, their personal identity is totally blown away, and I'm just like, how are you going to deal with the publishing world if you can't handle this criticism? But it is true. It's like, with the rise of kind of Goodreads and social media, you're kind of inundated. You know, you get emails like about, I didn't agree with this point in your essay, and you're like, okay, that's great. So it's actually
one of the best antidotes I find to these things is if you go on Goodreads and you like look at the Goodreads reviews for, say, Anna Karenina or Middlemarch. And you'll find these like absolutely horrendous 1-star reviews, and that just makes you feel a million times better.
Right. Or like reviews like, I like the original better, or something like that. Like, they think this is an adaptation or something like of the movie. Like the adaptation of Anna Karenina, the movie. That's so funny. All right, so back to the book. You juggled so many different perspectives. I actually love that. I think, you know, as someone, I'm really adverse to writing chapters, but I love reading your chapters, because not only were they kind of like very crystallized, I feel like you sort of moved the story along very well with the perspective. Like, it never dragged. It was very kind of like light, and it never felt like I was confused as to who was speaking, you know. It reminded me a lot of, and this is a great compliment, As I Lay Dying, Faulkner's kind of like many different perspectives, and they were kind of all fun, and they were short. Like, I think that's like kind of the trick, is that you don't want to stay in that mind for so long. How did you kind of come to this structure? Did it naturally fall out? Was it a lot of editing? Was it a lot, like, did you originally try like Amy's perspective or Jim's perspective, and then found it hard to kind of sustain that?
No, I knew I always wanted to tell it from the kind of multitude of perspectives. And I think this comes from, so I initially started writing with short stories. That's, I didn't have, an MFA in creative writing or anything. I'm largely self-taught. And so I love the short story form, and that's how I honed my craft. And of course, with short stories, you're always allowing yourself to jump in and out of different characters' heads. And for me, part of the magic of writing is being able to do that, because our own real lived experience is, of course, just limited to ourselves, and that can be claustrophobic. You can often feel quite sick of your own perspective sometimes. And so for me, that's the joy I get from writing, is inhabiting other worldviews. And till now, I haven't written a book told from one main protagonist's perspective. My first novel was alternating dual perspectives, and my first book was a short story collection. So I really enjoy that. So I knew that I wanted to continue that. And there's been some, wonderful novels told through those perspectives. I just want to check, Weike, can you still hear me?
I think she
Hello?
somehow has left the Zoom. I don't know if it was her connection, but maybe finish this thought and then we can move
Yeah,
on. It comes back on.
yeah. So anyway, I was really wanting to tell this story from those different perspectives, because because I think they can shed light on a common experience. And in this family, that is what we see. We see that each character is nursing their own form of guilt and shame around what happened to baby Ruby, and because they are not talking to each other, we, as the reader, we really need that third person limited interior perspective to understand the depth of their grief.
I'm back. I'm so sorry. I think my Zoom on my desktop just died. I don't know. I've been on Zoom all day, so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So yeah, in a nutshell, I was just saying, in terms of the short story and the freedom to jump into different perspectives and to shed light on a common experience. And in this particular story, each character nurses their individual guilt and shame around what happened.
Yeah. So the book is like very short. It's like 200 pages. And I love small books. Like, I actually finished this book in one sitting. I love 200-page books. It's like I sometimes go on a train ride, and in sort of a 4-hour train ride or something, I can kind of like read it, and it's a great experience. Was there a lot of editing involved in this, or was it like, did it come out sort of the length that it came out?
I love editing. It's probably one of my favorite things to do, in terms of, like, I find the first draft quite painful. The blank page is quite daunting. So, and again, I'm going to, hark back to my apprenticeship in short stories as, training me to be quite a brutal editor. Write to word count. Most short story comps are, around 3,000 to 5,000 words. You kind of learn to question every word. Is it holding its weight, either driving the story or the character? And so I've always struggled to write, lengthy books. But even in my reading tastes, I am drawn to short books, and I feel like at the moment they are having something of a moment.
Yeah, they are.
Oh, won the Booker Prize recently is a very book.
Western Lane, right? I read Western. That was last year?
Yeah. So and I don't know if you know Claire Keegan, the Irish writer.
Love it.
Brilliant novellas. So I love that kind of tautness, that restraint, and be weighty, emotionally weighty, even though physically slim and light. So I do.
And I'm not gonna, I think the novella, or that kind of like shorter form, was popular also of Mice and Men, if I think about it, right? Like Breakfast at Tiffany, all of these shorter form storytelling methods, and then, you know, the story got longer. So I always feel like the 200-page kind of thing is great. Like I feel like you get this full arc, right? And then you get to explore a lot of different kind of characters. So for, you know, for me, it's the same way. Like I cut a lot, but I think when I turn in, it's always actually quite short. Like I sort of already have, you know, I don't, I talked to my editor and sometimes she's like, oh, this author turned in like 700 pages. I'm like, how can you turn in 700 pages? Like that's demanding so much of someone's time, right? And I think sometimes I'm like sort of like very cognizant of it. So you mentioned that writing is something that was self-taught for you. How did that happen? Like you were a doctor, you know, you do so many different things. How did that happen? How did you find time?
Well, I mean, I was always an avid reader as a child, and you know, really relished any experience, any opportunity for creative writing throughout high school. But then, you know, I grew up in Hong Kong, and we did English A levels. So reaching the end of high school, you have to really, it's quite brutal. You only choose like 3 subjects or something to do for English A levels. So you really have to narrow it down. And I did, you know, want to potentially do medicine. And so I didn't give up English literature, but I had to kind of, you know, pivot more towards the sciences. And then, of course, medicine itself is so demanding that I didn't do a lot of reading, let alone writing, throughout the training. But when the training does eventually end, it sometimes feels like it won't, but it does. And then suddenly you do have your time again.
Yeah.
Something that was quite pivotal for me was I attended a Creative Doctors Network seminar in Australia. Where they don't exist anymore, but at the time it was such a great event for me to go to, because I met all these doctors who are very just amateur artists doing film and photography, visual arts, writing. But what struck me at this day where it was just a celebration and showcasing of work was how happy these doctors were compared to the doctors that I'd come across in my training. I thought, oh, there might be something here, you know, this may be protective against burnout. And it kind of gave me permission to pursue it. And so I did. And being a kind of type A personality, I needed a deadline. I needed something to kind of push me. So I wrote stories for competitions and journals and just kept doing that. And I guess I used the feedback or lack thereof as you know, if a story got shortlisted, for instance, I'd use that. Okay, there's something here. There's something good here. That was kind of the feedback. It was very non-confrontational because you either hear nothing or you get a shortlisting. And eventually I joined, you know, some writers groups and got that kind of feedback too. And look, the first book took me 10 years. It was just writing stories, and eventually I'd accumulated kind of enough to put together into an anthology. And yeah, so it was quite organic, took a long time, but yeah, of course, reading was a really essential component of that. And you read differently when you start writing as well. So
I actually feel like reading just becomes, you know, I have a few books that I want to read for enjoyment over winter break or, you know, your summer break, but it's actually, for the most part, reading has become work, right? Because you sort of have to think about what made you really like this paragraph or this sentence, what made the story click for you, you know. Like for your story, there are these moments where I love this moment where Amy was like, I love this sentence, like she really wanted a fight, and that's how that's how that chapter ended. Like she really wanted to get in a fight with someone, and I was like, oh my God, right? And then that happens in the next scene, and I think you do those like really small dramatic kind of like explosions or really well, but it's not like rushed. It doesn't feel contrived. It feels natural to these characters. So those things were just gems. But you know, like when you're writing and you're teaching, I'm always like, how does she do that? How does she like get to that thing so quickly? There's that craft element of it as well, right? So coming back to the story, how long did it take you for this project?
I think all up, it was probably 12 to 18 months of kind of thinking and writing to get to get the manuscript in a position to where I was happy to show it to my agent, and then the pub. Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned that recently at a book event, and they said, "Oh my God, 18 months! I could read it in 2 to 3 hours."
No, but that's like that's what people, and honestly, that's actually probably good, right? Like sometimes I think about books that take me a really long time to read, and I'm not sure if that's a compliment to the.
Well, I think they were just shocked by how much work goes into a shorter work. Now, of course, some short stories take writers 5 years to write. It's not necessarily proportional, the hours to the output of words. There's a lot that goes into the work. But for me, 18 months has probably been the quickest of the 3 books that I've written.
18, well, it's also like that you write it, but then the editing process sometimes takes 9 months, right? Like, and my editor always says like the publishing process is like a gestation period. So you really have to double the time. And there's so many things they don't tell you about, like marketing and things like that you kind of have to get involved in. So, yeah. What's kind of your I mean, I think everyone likes to talk about process. What's kind of your writing process? Do you write every day? Do you have a routine? Do you are there days that you don't write? And I can answer that question too, but I thought I was just interested in your method.
Yeah, when my first book was published, I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. So I've never really had, since becoming a professional writer, I've never really had like great swathes of time in which to write. I've had friends that go to the woods in Tasmania.
Really?
Shut out the world for a week and work on the structural edits of their manuscripts. And I've always been hugely envious of them, but that's never been my process, just because of personal circumstances. So I've always worked in kind of short bursts. I still work part-time in general practice here. So I work 4 short days a week. And my children are older now, like 13 and 10. And so they're a bit more independent, but they still need a lot of driving around. So that takes up a fair bit of my time. So if I'm in the middle of a project, I will try my best to work on it every day, but that may only be for an hour, or if I'm lucky.
No, I'm actually kind of in the same boat. I think a common question I get from my friends, a lot of them who are doctors, they're like, "Oh, Weike, do you just write every day now? Are you like a full-time doctor or like writer?" And I'm like, "No, like you can't do that. There's no way I could write for 8 hours a day. Like you guys look at charts. It's impossible." I think I've realized that I can do 2 or 3, but I can edit for much longer, but I just can't. I don't have the creative energy to go all day. And I don't even write every day. I only write when I have an idea. And after Rental House, there was like 6 months where I didn't write anything. I was writing letters of recommendations, writing like, workshop pieces, responses, but I wasn't writing anything creatively. And I sometimes feel like you need that, like you need your brain to kind of just fallow out a little bit and do other stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, during the pandemic, I mentioned already that it was kind of a period of creative drought for me, but it actually got so bad where I was quite resigned to that I'd never write another thing. But I was surprised that I was kind of okay with that. I guess I'd never thought of myself as a writer, when I was younger, and I was pleased that I'd had 2 books already published at that point. But what I've learned through that process, I think, is that even when you feel that depleted creatively, the green shoots can sprout. It may take time, but I think I will look back at that experience in the future if I am feeling that kind of depletion again, and know that it can come, but you don't know how long that will take and where, the inspiration will come from in the future. I have that experience to draw on again, and so that I hope will bring me some comfort.
A writing teacher told me, and now at the time I was like, what are you talking about? Trust the process. And that's really, I think it's really hard for someone to trust the process if you're in kind of more of a STEM oriented field. Like it was really hard for me to transition out of that a little bit. I think a lot of people are sort of like, how do you know what to write if no one tells you? And that's a very good question. How do you know what to write if no one tells you? Well, you have to tell yourself. Like, that's sort of the goal of writing. And yeah, I'm just getting more comfortable with periods of time where I'm just not writing. Like this summer I went to this residency in Italy, and then for like 4 or 5 weeks I didn't do any writing. I played, I did a lot of Zoom stuff. I didn't do any writing. I drank a lot of coffee, and it was like fun. And I think sort of creative people need that a little bit. And sort of as my mind is shifting more towards the creative side, because I do have the same like left brain, right brain thing. It's like weird. They operate totally differently. And versus like someone who's, like a doctor, like Jin's a doctor, right? So he kind of has this way of thinking about things. And so, so is Amy. That's like everything has to have sort of a purpose, a reason, a cause. And it bothers him when he can't like figure things out very, very clearly. There's that moment in the book where Jin is having this kind of like uncomfortable confrontation with like mental health, and I thought that was kind of a great moment of thinking about just like the mental health toll that a lot of these things like the pandemic, geopolitical circumstances, the environment, right, takes on people. And is that something that you see in your practice that you sort of wanted to bring into your story?
Yeah, well, ironically, a few weeks ago, I was invited to give a talk about balancing life. And, in the middle of like this publicity tour, and I had very little balance to my life. So I was thinking, what am I going to say to these people? And I do remember, when I'd made that decision to start writing as well as being a doctor, read that Stephen King book on writing and how he says, think about how much crap TV you watch, and you can and that's what I did initially. But then it also got too much to your point about needing time for rest and to rest the brain. I got to a point where I was filling every moment of my day in some kind of productive way. If it wasn't working at the clinic, it was, doing stuff for the kids. If it wasn't that, it was, shopping. And then whenever I had any other moment, I'd fill it with writing, and I got really burnt out. And so I realized, and that was something that I brought up in that talk about balancing writing with life, is that there is actually, we should prioritize rest time, and not that rest time is not you doing yoga or doing exercise. It's like pure rest time, just maybe it's lying staring at the ceiling and not thinking about anything, or just allowing the process to happen. And I think in this current modern day society where every moment has to be productive or accountable, where there is this real risk of burnout. And I do see that in my practice. I do see that a lot in my practice.
Well, like I think physicians are more and more getting measured by like productivity units, or like just like how productive you are. And I think at the end of the day, people forget that hospitals are a business. They're not like a nonprofit, right? They're there to kind of provide a service and make money. And so yeah, they have this like, worker employer situation. I still tutor a lot of MCAT, which is like the entrance exam for a lot of pre-med students in the US. And it's just the reality of medicine. and sort of like the perception of medicine, of young people going into it. I think the pandemic was a big moment for a lot of people realizing what could happen. And the language that, you know, in the States and I think elsewhere people were using for like healthcare professionals was that, oh, this is the front lines, or this is war. And you're like, you're not training doctors for war. You know, this is not the military. You're training brains. You're training them to think about diseases. You're training them to think about pathology. You're not giving them a gun, right? And there's just that the language of military infiltrating the language of medicine just seemed so ironic to me, right? So counterintuitive to this idea of healing, you know, right? Being on the front lines, and yet you're healing people.
Well, one of the things I really enjoy doing is I'm a guest lecturer at this narrative medicine course at the University of Melbourne here in Australia. I believe is hugely inspired by the one run at Columbia. And I love it because basically narrative medicine, what it does is it recognizes that not only does the patient not present with a list of symptoms and signs, and they don't just represent a diagnostic dilemma, they are a whole person and they present with the story of the illness, but it also recognizes that the doctor themselves is bringing their past and their humanity and their, you know, prejudice and everything and their own story to the encounter. And that is something that is not taught. Well, it certainly wasn't taught to me when I did my medical training, you know, 20 or so years ago. It almost treats you like you are a robot to kind of process information and spew out a diagnosis at the end. It's taught in this very cool clinical way, and you know, even when awful things happen on the ward, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for debriefing or counseling around that kind of thing. And so yeah, I like that, you know, this narrative medicine is emerging and recognizing that the people involved in these decisions and diagnoses are humans, and there is so unfortunately at this stage it's an elective kind of course, so there is some self selection of people, but I think it's actually would be of benefit to all medical students and maybe even all doctors to have some training in narrative medicine.
Oh, I 100% believe that, or in humanities. Like, I was talking to a PA yesterday, and he was just like, if you think AI is ever going to take care of diagnoses, like yeah, the machine can tell you how to interpret an EKG, but at the end of the day, nothing accounts for experience. And I 100% agree with that. Like, as just someone who writes, experience and being able to kind of figure out what you like is important, and figure out what is good and what is bad. That's important. And I think, you know, if you just treat doctors like robots without feeling with, you're discounting all of their subjective experience that they've had, that they can kind of intuit certain things that ChatGPT is not going to. And I know that there's so many diagnosis tools out there that can just tell you what the disease is. But that's totally not what medicine is built for, right? Yeah.
Yeah, when I first started as a GP, I remember, because no one taught me about this, but you know, I'd see a couple of patients as a registrar in general practice, and I was feeling like I wasn't really doing much for them. We were just chatting, you know, but then they'd come in a few weeks later and say, I feel so much better, like after, but I was so baffled. I was, why do you feel better? Well, just from having chatted to you about these things. And it was, the reason I was baffled was because no one had ever really articulated or explained that the actual interaction is therapeutic, potentially. And that's powerful. I don't know why no one ever really explained that to me. We should acknowledge it. And the other thing, you know, that people don't talk a lot about is that kind of gut feeling you have as a physician. You know, you might look at a patient and their obs are all fine, their labs are all fine, but you just have this feeling that something's not right. And I tend to listen to that feeling. It's particularly pertinent when you're dealing with children who have more difficulty, obviously, expressing themselves and articulating their symptoms. But the sick child and recognizing the sick child is something that, you know, you can't. It comes from experience, I think, and most pediatricians will acknowledge that and agree with that. So yeah, I agree. I don't think that doctors are going to be replaced by ChatGPT.
No, definitely not.
I have many people that tell me to my face, I'm going to be replaced.
Oh, 100%. Definitely not. You do not want a machine to do the diagnosis or to put in your feeding tube. I don't think. And
Well,
or like
the same applies to writing. You know, we keep being told that AI is going to write our books for us, but
I know.
I've seen some of the examples, and you know, I don't want to write books. It's not there yet.
Like AI is good, but I think I look at it and I can kind of tell it's written by AI because there's almost no voice, there's no style, and there's no variation. There's a sense of like gussing up a sentence, but it's very consistent. Like it's like sentence gerund, sentence gerund, sentence gerund. Like, you know, like it's very kind of formulaic, and it's odd sometimes. So I generally can tell when my students are turning in ChatGPT, and I'm just like, hi Tim, I'm pretty sure this is ChatGPT. Because it just doesn't sound like how they naturally talk. And I generally find your writing voice is a little bit in line with kind of how you talk, like the rhythm, sort of like how you read, how you think, the length of sentence and things like that. So,
well, someone who works with my husband recently, as he came to my launch in Australia, and a few weeks later, he asked ChatGPT to write a short story in the style of Melanie Cheng.
Oh,
and then
really?
Recorded it just as, you know, just for fun. And yeah, I really could not. I didn't see any similarities in the voice whatsoever. It was felt very flat to me. Obviously, I'm completely biased, but yeah,
no, it's true.
It felt flat. Like in kind of emotion and intensity.
There's just something off about it. No, I totally agree. Okay, so maybe we'll pivot to some audience questions, and you know, there's one audience question, I'll read it, and then if you have other questions, please type it into the Q&A. So this question is from Kathleen. I so appreciate the very delicate balance of this book. Totally correct. I think it's all the characters and all the perspectives. Were you aware of that? If so, were you conscious managing it? So much with withheld, unspoken, marital strain, struggling child, or in the past, grief, or otherwise in the background, i.e. the pandemic.
So can you repeat the first bit of the question, Weike?
Yeah, the question is, I so appreciate the very delicate balance of this book. Were you aware of that? So I think she's kind of thinking about how you balance marital strain and, you know, the grief and the child, like the struggling child.
Yeah. So I am a writer who doesn't plan much in terms of
I don't either.
Yeah, I tend to come to a work with either like a premise. I might have a sense of the ending, but that's open. And I come to it with the idea of the characters. So for me, with this particular book, I knew that the rabbit was going to play a role in disrupting this family, and also a role potentially in them coming together and healing. And I knew I wanted to write about a family that was dealing with the accidental sudden loss of a child, because that was my kind of greatest fear, and I wanted to write towards that. The other aspects, the kind of the marital discord, Lucy's, obsessions with death and her intrusive thoughts, they kind of arose through the process of writing the characters. And again, in addition to the multitude of perspectives and inhabiting different characters, to me, as part of the joy and magic of writing is that in the process of putting words to paper, these ideas kind of emerge in the process. So I don't want to know where I'm going, or because for me, then that would ruin the suspense for me as a writer, or so I have strong sense of characters, but then present them with this incredible grief. How would a 10-year-old in a pandemic deal with that? I knowing that Lucy was an introverted child, a bookish child, well, of course she's going to retreat, she's going to hide. That's her nature, which is very similar and complemented by the rabbit. Prey animal burrows itself into the ground. Jin, his character is very practical. He is nursing this enormous grief around his role and his failure in the greatest emergency, of his life. And so, he's a type A kind of perfectionist. He's just thinking, why did I fail? And just berating himself over having not anticipated this. He saw some signs, in Pauline on that day. Why didn't he do something? And it's incredibly toxic, this kind of constant self-flagellation around that.
And also self-destructive, like Jin becomes very self-destructive,
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of his behavior is almost a form of self-sabotage. He's punished, even without giving away spoilers, his interaction with other women, he's self-sabotaging, because he wants to be punished for what he did. Pauline, similarly, she escaped after the accident because she knew she played this role, even though it wasn't a deliberate role. But she's more feisty. She doesn't hold as much kind of guilt. She has perspective, I think, as the older character, having witnessed, having lost her partner, having witnessed his infidelity. I think she's a little bit more at peace with the random, brutal nature of the universe. She knows that. The others are still kind of in denial about that, and a refusal to kind of accept that perhaps this is just a terrible tragedy, and tragedies happen, and they can't keep on blaming themselves for their role in it.
Of course. And this comes back to, I think you do forgiveness really well in this book, like marital strain. Like sometimes you're not just going to be like, okay, we're done, goodbye, see you later, right? When I teach students who are in college, they're always like, I am so surprised they did not get divorced. And you're like, that's a whole endeavor, And as you get older, you realize how complex adult relationships or marital relationships are, right? The ability, you want to be good people, but sometimes people make mistakes, right? And so there's this enormous generosity that you need to have with partners to be able to make relationships work. And I just love my students, they need to just get divorced. It's like, okay, so it's like the black and white, just get divorced. It's like, divorces take a long time.
Yeah, and I think for this family, the unthinkable has happened. So, everything, all the behaviors that they make, in the wake of this accident need to also be taken in that context. These are not people who are of sound mind necessarily. They are in a terrible stage of grief and guilt and shame, and we don't all deal with that well. We do terrible things. We drink heavily, and we do impulsive things as a way of punishing ourselves and those around us, and as a means of escape, of course. And so I think
have a parallel experience. I think that's sometimes people think about what if, right?
And Amy is nursing her own guilt around, having not been present at the accident. And I mean, that was important to me, that each character is kind of grappling with their own role. So for Jin, the worst possible thing that could have happened was that he was unable to physically save his daughter. For Amy, the worst possible thing is that she wasn't present for it, you know. For you know, Lucy, you know, she struggles to even, you know, comprehend the gravity of the situation. She even has to remind herself actually to grieve because it feels unreal, you know.
Well, she does it in tiny ways. She's like, oh, that's you know, that's the seat, right? Or like a car seat or things like that. She does it in, I think that's how kids do it. Okay, so we have a question from Michelle. Hi, Mel and Weike. I'm a big fan of both of your works. This chat has been lovely. My question to both of you, your characters are very different from myself, yet I found that I could really empathize with their feelings and experience. How do you go about writing characters so empathetically, especially when they're different to you? Do you find that, well, for you, do you find that your experience as a physician helps? So you can take it away with that.
Yeah, I think for me, it was important because even though this is third person, it's very close third person. So I felt like I did have to, you know, really be able to inhabit the characters. And so for me, each character does share some similarities to me. So for Jin, he's a doctor, he has Chinese heritage like myself. So that was kind of the in for his character. With Amy, she's a mother, she's a writer. So that was my way in. For Lucy, you know, I was a child like Lucy, a bookish child, an introverted child. I have a lot of preoccupations with death as a child as well. And so again, I need kind of a way in to a character, and then I can kind of expand on it. And then it starts to become not me anymore. But I do that for this particular book, where it required really that kind of intensity of emotional connection, I needed my way in. With the short story collection, it was different. You know, they're shorter pieces. You don't necessarily need to be that close personally or demographically to the characters. So I think it depends on the work. For me, with work, I knew I wanted to be really emotionally intense, and so that was my way in.
Yeah. I think for me, so right now I'm writing a book where the character is significantly flawed. And I think one of the things when writing empathetic characters, you really have to kind of embrace flaws and sort of be open to just really no one is perfect, really. And the more you try to write a perfect character, the less the reader is going to believe you, you know, like the more you try to convince the character, you should like my character, the less they're going to believe you. So like with third person, with first person, just a little bit of self-deprecation, not wallowing, but a little bit of like self-awareness, self-deprecation kind of helps to make to bring the reader in. So I'm always like, don't aim for perfection. Don't make the protagonist the hero. It's actually better when they're not the hero. Like think about the beginning of Emma. Emma Woodhouse was handsome, rich, and clever. Where do you go from there? You have to tear her down, right? And that's what Austen knew how to do, was like, no one wants to read a perfect character. They always want the descent. And then you retrieve them back from the pit. So I think about that a lot when I'm teaching, is like, you have to think about flaws a lot. Okay, so Antonella has a question. What are you both currently reading or on your, I guess, bed stack, to be read stack, TBR? I don't know that abbreviation. To be read stack. What are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading, so in Australia, we have an author, Helen Garner, who I believe is getting some acclaim over there in the States as well.
Yeah.
She and I'm reading her latest, which is nonfiction. It's called The Season. It's about Australian rules football, but it's really about her as a grandmother now, in her 80s, kind of trying to reconnect with her grandson before it's too late, through the act of watching him play sport. I guess I'm really interested in these cross-generational relationships. You know, I've now explored that in the Burrow and in my other novel, Room for a Stranger. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I'd like to read Orbital by Samantha Harvey, the Booker Prize winner, and also Australian shortlisty Charlotte Wood's Stoneyard Devotionals on my TBR.
Great, cool. What am I reading? Well, for work, because I'm kind of writing about a crazed writer a little bit. I was working my way through Kafka's Diaries, and for anyone who just like thinks it's kind of funny to read about another writer's misery, I highly recommend Kafka's Diaries. They're funny because despair can be funny. And January, he hates the month of January. He can never write in January, but you just these entries of like, I could not write, I could not write, I could not write. You know, writing is terrible. And then he has like these long entries about Napoleon, and it's just so random. And I love the writer's mind. I love being in the writer's mind. But I think for a fun read this holiday break, I was gonna do Tomorrow. I feel like I don't know that much about video games. My husband plays a lot of video games, but I feel like that's a great book. The great concept. So I kind of want to read that just to sort of read something completely different from what I'm writing, and something that I, just seems like would be totally fun. So alrighty then. I feel like I answered all these questions and we did a great job with this conversation. Let us know. Please buy these books. They're great. Well, Mel, I read your book. Like, that was the most recent book I read.
And I should have mentioned Rental House. It will be on my TBR, top of the pile.
Well, thank you both so much. This was just a very fun conversation. It was great that you were able to join us from Australia and in New York. And congratulations to you both on both of your books. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Georgie.
All right, perfect.
Well, good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, Mel.
Bye. Bye, Wendy.
Bye.